Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final session of TDK Ventures Energy Week 2022. As a quick refresher, TDK Ventures is the venture capital arm of the Japanese electronic giant TDK Corporation. I hope you enjoyed the rich insights from the previous session so far, where we discussed a variety of topics related to the future of green hydrogen and chemicals, the future of battery development, the future of energy transformation in emerging markets, and the future of EV and charging infrastructure. My name is Tina Tosakovong. I am an investment director at TDK Ventures, where I focus on investments in climate tech and advanced materials. I will be moderating our fireside chat session today on the topic of the future of mining and battery supply chain with our esteemed guest, Mr. Joe Lowry, who has been dubbed by the industry players as Mr. Lithium. And that's because he is the world renowned expert in the lithium resource topic. Joe spent over 2 decades at FMC Lithium Company, where he served as president and director of two highly profitable Asia based lithium companies and drove FMC's rapid growth in the green energy sector focused on lithium ion battery materials. Joe is currently the president of Global Lithium LLC, providing lithium advisory services to major lithium producers, users, investors, hedge fund, and government. You would normally see him on several media, and he also hosts the Global Lithium podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other leading podcast apps. So don't forget to check out his channel after our event today. So, Joe, it is a pleasure to welcome you to Energy Week 2022. How are you feeling today? Didn't miss anything?
That was probably a little bit over the top. So thank you.
Awesome. It's really great to have you with us today. I do have so many questions I wanted to ask you, but I also want to remind the audience that you can also ask your question at any time by typing into the Q&A section on the top right of your screen. And you can also vote on your favorite question, and we will pull the popular question to ask Joe in about 40 minutes from now. So let's get started. First of all, I have a confession to make. Perhaps I'm the only clean tech investor who doesn't own Tesla. I thought I'm just gonna wait until the supply chain problems getting a little easier. But this year we've seen the crazy lithium ion price going up very high, like $70,000 per ton, right? And I feel like my dream Tesla is just slipping away. So I wanted to ask you, has this ever happened before? And what is the real reason behind the price going up like this, Joe?
Well, lithium is subject to supply and demand, just like anything else. And what you're seeing now is a situation where we've been waiting for a couple of decades for the so called hockey stick in EV demand to actually happen. Ironically, it happened during COVID, but it has happened. Everything you read now, it's not just about China anymore. It used to be China and Tesla, and now everybody's trying to jump into the game. It's put real pressure on lithium supply, and that's going to continue for a long time. We have had price spikes before, but they were usually very short lived, and there would be a supply response. And a lot of analysts are out there saying the same thing's going to happen this time. I would just say that if you look at 2005 to 2007 or early 2016 into 2018 when we had price spikes before, that was on the back of very low EV penetration. In the case of the first one I mentioned, EVs had nothing to do with it. It was because one miner in Australia went into receivership for an unrelated to lithium situation, and the supply dried up for a while, and that drove price up in 2016 and 17. It was partially just the whole battery demand growth, but you had a supply response pretty quickly by five mines that came on in a relatively short period of time in Australia. That's not
Mhm.
happening this time because the demand growth this year will be about what global demand was in 2016. We've never seen this kind of growth. And unfortunately, the lithium industry is small, it's dominated by a few players, and it's not able to quickly respond.
So you mentioned that it's corresponding to the supply and demand, but this time compared to other metal like nickel and cobalt, it was soaring in 2018 before, but it all came down. So this time, is lithium going up, staying there, or do you foresee that this is just maybe a temporary panic buy in anticipation and then it will all smooth out, or what happened to the supply chain?
I don't think it's a panic. I think some people are panicking and they should because what happened is you didn't have the investment the last 5 years that you
Mm.
needed. You can build a battery factory in a couple of years. You can build cathode quicker than that, but it takes sometimes a decade to bring a lithium project on. And that's where we are. We have a complete mismatch. And yes, at some point in the future, lithium will be in oversupply again. But I don't
Mm.
believe that happens in the next 7 to 10 years. If you look at the other industries, whether it's nickel or cobalt, they're much bigger, and especially nickel, copper as well, much bigger than lithium. The entire lithium chemicals market didn't reach $1 billion worldwide until 2015. It's a small industry. Right
Mm.
now, the top four players have over 60% of the supply, and they can't keep up. So you need a lot more companies coming in, and that is happening on paper, but you also have a situation where people want green energy, they want EVs, but a lot of these countries, including the one I'm sitting in and you're sitting in, tends to not want mining. And you can't have it both ways. You can't say we want 50% of the cars to be EVs in 2030 and then refuse to give permits to mining projects.
Mm. So let's double click on that. Who owns and control and develop lithium resources? Where is lithium around the world and what does the cost curve?
First of all, right now, there are two major forms of lithium. One comes from brine resources, mostly in South America, some in Western China, and hard rock resources, which is dominated by Western Australia. The top four lithium companies, the biggest is based about 25 minutes from where I'm sitting in Charlotte, North Carolina. Tomorrow, but their assets are in Chile, in Western Australia, in China. So it's a US company, but most of the lithium it has doesn't come from the US. It does have a small operation in Silver Peak, Nevada. The next big operator is SQM, which is a Chilean company that operates on the Atacama and also has a project they're developing with a company called West Farmers in Western Australia. And then the other two of the top four are two Chinese companies, Gangfen and Tianqi. Mostly hard rock at this point, although Gangfen has multiple brine investments in Argentina and she has potentially access to some brine assets as well. But those are the top four. And as I said before, they have over 60% of the supply right now. And that's just a situation where, as much as they're trying to grow as fast as they can, they need help. The next two players are much, much smaller than the big four. That would be Allchem, which was a merger of Galaxy and Orocobre. They have multiple brine assets now with a merger in South America and operating hard rock in Western Australia. And then Livent, which is the old FMC Lithium, which is where I got my experience. They've been stuck in neutral for 10 years and hopefully they bring on their expansion next year, but it's been a long time in coming and they're still relatively small now.
That's very insightful. And in terms of the global cost curve, what does it look like right now?
Well, let's peel that back in two ways. First of all, let's talk about lithium carbonate. There's two main lithium chemicals used to make cathodes, lithium carbonate and lithium hydroxide. And if you look at the lithium carbonate cost curve and you take royalties out of it for
Mhm.
now, the Atacama in Chile is the low cost producer by far. But that's an increasingly meaningless number with the way prices are because price is disconnected from the cost curve right now. But The Atacama is the lowest, and then across the Andes in Argentina, they're on average probably about 1,500 to 2,000 a ton higher than the Atacama. The Qinghai assets in China are much higher because they're lower quality, have high magnesium. There's a lot more weather issues in Shanghai. When you look at hydroxide, there's kind of a mythology out there that hard rock is the cheap way to hydroxide. And that's true for the very best asset on the planet, which is Greenbushes. They have the lowest cost position in hydroxide. But the next part of the cost curve would be the best brine guys who then take sellable lithium carbonate and convert it into hydroxide. They're in the middle of that cost curve. And then as you go out, the converters in China are at the high end of the hydroxide
Mm.
cost curve. So it's bipolar.
Wow, that's very insightful on the cost curve. And I think that leads me to the next questions, right? As we are saying that we're going to need a lot more and there should be more newcomers joining the game. Do we still have good lithium resources to develop? And how do you see greenfield projects on salas, rock, clay, and geothermal? Which do you think could be promising?
Well, Australia will continue to build out hard rock. You have more coming on in Brazil and some other areas of the world. There's plenty of lithium out there, but governments have to encourage mining and not condemn it. It's not that easy to get a project permitted, especially in the United States. And that's what's held up the US getting back into the game. When I was selling initially to the battery industry, it was US lithium coming from North
Mm,
Carolina from a hard rock mine that
mm.
ultimately shut down in favor of lower cost brines. So the existence of lithium is, Elon Musk likes to say, it's everywhere. That may be a bit of a stretch, but there's plenty of lithium in the ground. The trick is getting investment and permission to extract it.
Very interesting. Thanks for shedding lights on lithium supply side. So let's switch gear and talk about the impact of lithium on the downstream EV supply chain a little bit. I think the lithium situation that we are in, it seems like the EV companies are blaming the cell makers, and the cell makers are blaming the miners. Who do you think is getting hurt the most from these lithium shortages? And how do you see the investment and vertical integration of lithium?
Well, it's definitely not the lithium companies getting hurt the most because if you look at what's happened with price and you look at the earnings of the lithium producers, that all looks pretty good. But this is the interesting thing. You can go back just a couple of years, and many of the CEOs of legacy automakers would be asked about lithium, and they say, "That's not my problem. It's the battery guy's problem." Well, you can take that attitude, but 2 years later, it's the car company's problem because they can't get the battery packs in large enough numbers to come out with all these announced vehicles. When you look at what the big auto companies have said about electrification and put a date on it, some cases 2035, in some cases 2030, that they would go all electric, it's probably not going to happen simply because they were myopic in thinking the supply chain would just magically appear. And it hasn't. And it's pretty obvious that it hasn't.
That's pretty interesting. And I think some people were just starting talking about would this short term price hike of all the lithium resources start us onto a new path like the hydrogen fuel cell vehicle and things like that? What is your thought on that?
I go back to the last cycle, and a lot of the analysts said $30 lithium will kill the battery industry. And these
Mm.
people didn't do the calculus on the impact of lithium on the cost of a cell or a battery pack because lithium wasn't a big contributor then. Obviously, at current lithium prices, it's much more significant. But if you look at the high end and you take a 100 kilowatt hour Tesla, which has about 80 kilograms of lithium carbonate equivalent in it, and you do the price differential on the total price of the car, I don't think that's killing demand. My only point is that yes, lithium price will have obviously a much bigger impact on the very low end. You have another dynamic though that's happening, and that's that lithium iron phosphate batteries were written off as only being for ESS and buses a few years ago by many. I was not one of them. I was happy to see Elon Musk come back and say Tesla will be using more lithium iron phosphate than high nickel in the future, and see BYD and CATL come out with new architectures for the pack designs that enabled more cathode in a given space, making LFP more viable. It takes a lot of the complexity out. You don't have to worry about the nickel sourcing. You don't have to worry about the
Mhm.
cobalt sourcing. Then lithium becomes your main problem. But it also shows how what people get fixated on is saying this is the only path. And if you go back 3 years and look at most of the lithium presentations, you would have seen people say, well, everybody's going to be using lithium hydroxide and high nickel batteries. The problem now is you've had a lot of capital and you've had a lot of decisions made. Says they're going to overtake Tesla by 2025. Trust me, that's not going to happen. But the other problem GM has, if they're promising to bring out models for a price point under 30,000 and think they're going to do it with a high nickel battery in the current raw material climate, I think that's going to be a tough go for them. And I think you're going to see globally that concessions are going to have to be made on battery capacity if people want to sell as many models as they say they want to sell until the lithium problem gets worked out.
That's pretty interesting. So maybe double click on that. So right now, what is the limiting factor for bringing up the new mines into production? How many years do we have to plan, and what is the longest step? Can you walk us through
You
that?
you can't really make a broad statement on that. You really have to go project by project, country by country, because there's different issues in each place. But the biggest problem up until the last couple of years was purely financing.
Mm,
Lithium projects couldn't get funded. And that's why so many have been out there for a decade, but they didn't have the capital to even start building them. Now it's
mm,
becoming, in some cases, still a permitting problem. If you're talking about a Thacker Pass or Piedmont not being able to get people to support their mine in North Carolina, so they're having to go to an inferior resource in Canada and another asset in Africa. And then you have a real interesting dynamic change. And that is if you go back a couple of years, China bought almost 100% of Australia's spodumene output. And now the Aussies they're building capacity. And it's not just the Aussies. Obviously, Albemarle's a US company, Tianqi's a Chinese company, SQM's a Chilean company, but there's big projects to make
mhm,
conversion capacity in Australia. So that's all lithium that's not going to China. And if the output was definitely going to China, it might not be as big a deal, but you're having major battery factories built in North America, in Europe. So Australia has a lot of options now on where their product goes. And you have a company like Tesla saying, hey, you want to build conversion on the Gulf Coast in the US. There are a lot of conversion projects on the board in Europe. They all need hard rock or carbonate feedstock from brine to build out those projects. So there's a real competition now for the lithium, which is why spodumene was selling for under $400 in the middle of 2020. Now contract prices are going up each quarter. Allchem, I think, said Mount Catlin was above 5,000 the last quarter.
jeez.
Pilbara is above 4, and Pilbara does an auction periodically, and the last price on that was almost 8,000.
So
So
everybody want to be friends with the Aussie now, right?
that's right. I mean, it's a huge flip
Yeah.
flop. 2 years ago, when I would do podcasts with the miners in Australia, it was almost like going to a funeral. And now it's a party.
Wow, this is very interesting. So, can you predict whether Elon Musk's next move is going to be buying a lithium mine? He just bought Twitter. So,
Well, Elon probably shouldn't have bought Twitter, and he probably should have bought Albemarle and Livent, and he would have created a moat, as Warren Buffett likes to call it, that would have given him a huge advantage. But Elon's gotten along in his life without my advice. So I
maybe
think he's going to continue to do whatever he wants to do. But I think Tesla's missed a huge opportunity to get in early. And I always say that Elon Musk has done more to create lithium demand and done more to prevent lithium supply than any other guy on the planet. And that's a huge contradiction. But the way he has spoken about lithium, go back to Battery Day in 2020, shaking the clay and the salt together and claiming he could make lithium no problem. And it had a negative effect on investment in lithium companies. People take what Musk says seriously. And he talked about just from Nevada, they could do all the lithium they needed. And that's not happening.
maybe they have to start selling it on Dogecoin. Anyway, I think enough too much joke. So let's get into the innovation topics. Perhaps maybe we talk a little bit about the LFP. How do you see the direction of the new chemistry and the IRA tax credit? It's not just the multiple lithium chemistry that we're talking about. There's also alternative chemistry people are coming out with. How will it impact the future lithium supply chain?
Well, people have been talking about solid state for a while. All solid state means is you don't have a liquid electrolyte, you have solid electrolytes. People talk about the original lithium ion design was metal in the anode, not lithium oxide cathodes. And I think there'll be steady technology progress on that. But I think that's a future state that people keep working on, and hopefully there's innovation. But right now we're kind of mired in how do we get from here to 2025 and 2027, and that's not going to be with new cathode. It's going to be with maybe with some tweaked cathode, but I don't see a huge innovation in cathode being the answer in the next 5 years. We're pretty well stuck around the high nickel, and you may say LMNO or something like that. But I think we're in a LFP and a high nickel universe for the near to midterm. What
Mhm.
happens beyond that really, I think, is still subject to the success of innovation and then the ability to make a metal that's pure enough to execute the technology. There are companies out there now saying they make at scale high purity lithium metal. It's not the purity that's needed to fully implement solid state. There has to be more innovation. The current lithium metal technology is not very good at scale. There's some innovators out there, and we'll see what happens with that.
So it looks like we're gonna be stuck with this for a while. So now maybe one of the hottest innovation topic we've heard is about the direct lithium extraction or DLE. Can you
Yes.
tell us a little bit what it is and would that be transformative and help us solve the lithium supply chain issue we are in?
Well, there's multiple variations of DLE, but to distill it to its essence is it's a situation where you produce the lithium from the resource in a matter of hours or days, not months through a pond system. But there's a lot of misinformation out there when a company says that they're 10,000 times faster than ponds. That's abject nonsense because once a pond system's in steady state, it's about what happens in the lithium plant. And DLE doesn't really have an advantage speed wise on an existing pond operation. The true of a DLE would be potential for higher quality, higher yield, and that's yet to be implemented at scale. I think everybody's out there waiting for it. And the other big attraction is that DLE can unlock resources that are in locations where you can't build ponds because the evaporation characteristics just don't work. And we're seeing that in the United States with what Standard Lithium's trying to do in Arkansas from a basically a byproduct from a bromine stream that has lithium in it, but they can't use ponds in Arkansas. They don't have the weather characteristics to do
I
ponds.
see. So if you
So,
don't have the right weather, then it doesn't evaporate. It's gonna be
it's
too
just
slow.
well, it just wouldn't happen. You couldn't possibly do it. You're going to have DLE where most of the geothermal is, but we've seen people attempting geothermal now for well over a decade, and we're still waiting for a success. Elon Musk tried to buy a DLE operation from a geothermal almost a decade ago now,
Which one
and
was that?
in the Salton Sea,
Uh-huh.
Southern
Wow.
California. And there's a lot of activity there now. Energy Source, Berkshire Hathaway, Controlled Thermal Resources, and you hear a lot of buzz about it. You just haven't commercial results yet.
Wow.
I am not anti DLE. I hope it
Uh-huh.
happens, but it's going to take time. It's still playing out. And that's why when people talk about the industry going into shortage in, say, 2023 or 2024, you just can't make the math work. The only thing that'll put lithium in oversupply in the next 5 years is a complete collapse of battery demand.
If that happened, it would be a good chance to buy a Tesla, but I don't think that is gonna come. So I'm pretty fascinated by the DLE, but as you mentioned, it seems like it needs to be developed. How do we validate the DLE and what
Well,
kind of unit
I,
economics can we expect from it? Would that be something that with IRA tax credit coming out, it can really change the trajectory, accelerate the innovation for these DLE startup companies?
I think the first DLE success will either be in Arkansas with what Standard's doing, or we'll be in South America. And I don't see the IRA as having that big an effect on DLE. I think people are serious about DLE. There's a lot of DLE players right now. They're working hard, but you have to prove the technology at a pilot scale and then a demo scale, and then people will build it out. But it's probably going to take 3 to 5 more years to play out.
Three.
That's why I think Standard's got an advantage now because they're pretty far along. But I'm not calling the winner here,
Mm.
just looking at it not really from afar. I've seen all these things close up, but you hear a lot more hype from the juniors about potential DLE miracles. And I think the
Mm.
ones you really want to pay attention to are more of the people that are just going on about their business. But this is pretty important because even on the eastern side of the Andes in Argentina, some of those assets, reasonable quality brine, but the evaporation characteristics aren't great, and you really need DLE to unlock it. And you'll see a company like Rio Tinto at Rincon trying to employ DLE, Lake's trying to employ DLE. There's plenty of DLE activity going on, but I don't see that as a 23, 24 thing. I see it as a 25 and beyond. Just look at the big lithium companies with conventional pond technologies and some of their expansions. They've all been late.
Mm.
Lithium's not that easy. And
Mm.
the other piece of that is that battery makers keep making the specifications harder. That's why lithium's not a commodity yet. So many analysts call lithium a commodity, but it's not a fungible good. The lithium of one company is not interchangeable with another at this point. And it's really only the battery companies that could get together and agree that if this spec is made, we can use it. That's not going to happen anytime soon.
This add the complexity to the developer. And I think I've heard that also the bigger company is looking at DLE, and then there's a lot of startups trying to come into the scene for the very first time. I want to touch a little bit as the investor. What would you suggest as the right business model for the DLE startups? Should they try to be the equipment seller? Should they try to license it to the miners?
Well, I mean,
And
you've got all the models out there. Every model is being employed at this point by somebody.
Hmm.
So let's just see who the winners are. But let's go back to one other really critical point on DLE. DLE is not a drop in because DLE works at one solar doesn't mean it's going to work at another solar. So this isn't like software. This is like buying a bespoke piece of clothing that is customized to your body because DLE has to be customized to each different brine, and all the brines are different. And when people talk about it, especially journalists, they tend to try to oversimplify it. And just because one solar does a 40,000 ton project with DLE and it works, doesn't mean 20 or 50 kilometers down the road it will necessarily work on a different brine.
Wow, this is very risky, but super interesting. What about the miners? What do they think in terms of the business model or relationship that they want with all these DLE startups? Are they welcoming partnership? What kind of relationship they want?
Well, I think you're watching it play out right now. And since there isn't commercial DLE, and people will say that Livent's operation in Hombre Muerto is DLE, it's really not true DLE because they have to have ponds as well. And to me, if you look at the kind of the strict definition of DLE, it means it's direct extraction and it doesn't use ponds. And if you look at China, Sun Resin will say they're doing DLE and it's been very successful. And the response is, I'm glad they're employing their technology, but everybody right now in China using DLE is also using ponds, as far as I know. And I think my information was current to last week. People can look at it any way they want to, but nobody ever called what Livent does DLE until a few years ago when it became a cool thing to talk about DLE. And then the people trying to sell DLE, some of them said, well, it's been done in Argentina for 20 years. And I think that was marketing the way I look at it anyway.
Very nice. Very, very insightful. So perhaps maybe one tips that I want to try to extract from you, Joe. So when we evaluate DLE company, what aspect would you suggest us look at as the key determination, key KPI on these DLE company? Is it water use, energy, waste,
You've
reagent?
got to go to the needs of the individual project. And there are certain places where there's abundant water. And if you're in the
Mm.
US and you're in Arkansas and you're doing DLE, water use isn't the criteria. If you're in the Atacama or you're on the east side of the Andes in Argentina, water can be a real problem. Then the other issue is, depending on the type of technology, is how easy is it to re-inject the brine back into a solar, which is what everybody would like to do. How is your process work? And is the tail able to be re-injected? That's another key question.
So it seems like that's probably not going to be the global king of the hill, but there's going to be a bunch of winners depending upon the particular areas that they are focusing on.
I always use the analogy of the 4 minute mile. It took years and years before Roger Bannister ran the first sub 4 minute mile. And then in the years following, many people did. Somebody just had to prove it could be done. And I'm hoping DLE is that way. I'm not negative on DLE. What I'm negative on is DLE hype. And the DLE purveyors who try to make DLE looking good by saying negative things about conventional ponds, which in most cases are meaningless. And I don't see
Very
DLE as a replacement to ponds. I see it in some cases as a supplement. In other cases, it's just another technology that will be deployed. But even with working DLE, ponds aren't going away.
fair enough. So before I open up the floor for the audience question, I want to get the lesson learned from you. You have extensive experience in China. You witnessed the takeoff of Chinese lithium ion batteries. Tell us more about what you saw and what we should learn.
I was in China really early when it was scary to walk into any lithium plant, especially where they made lithium metal, because the safety conditions. The first lithium metal plant I walked into in China, and you're talking about a cell at several hundred degrees. The guy didn't have socks on. He had sneakers on with no socks and no laces. And he was wearing pink rubber gloves like my grandmother used to wear when she washed dishes. And it was a hot August day. I got within about, I don't know, 35 feet of the cell. And I said, I'm not going any closer because it was arcing. I mean, we're talking 20 plus years ago. That was the way things were in China. And the chemical plants were the same way. And I'll plug Henry Sanderson's book, Volt Rush, and say if anybody's interested in how things played out here, I think he quotes Wang Xiaoshen from Ganfeng, who started out working in the Xinjiang lithium plant, and what conditions were like then. And I was in that plant in the year 2000.
Wear pink gloves.
And now I always likened it to like a Charles Dickens novel. And things have changed. I think that China has made, and I'm not the first guy to say this, it's made 100 years of progress in 20 years. Look at what a CATL's done. I was in the Gigafactory in Shanghai, and I think it was 1 gigawatt hour. And it actually might even have been an ATL plant now that I think about it. But that was kind of the beginnings.
Wow,
And
real pioneers. Amazing to hear.
and then Bullied had a cathode plant nearby. And the first time I met with BYD in 2000 in Shenzhen, before I'd heard of them, and I didn't know it meant build your dreams back then. But the first time I was served tea, I had to drink it really fast because the paper cup was so thin that if you didn't drink it fast, the tea would be leaked through the cup onto the table. And 3 years later, they're competing with Sony. China's made unbelievably fast progress, but people shouldn't forget that they didn't invent the technology. So I think that when America and the Europeans put their minds to it, it's going to be a better world because there's going to be more competition across the continents. And I think everybody's going to benefit from that.
Great. I think the game is on. This is wonderful. Wow, this has been a really fun and informative discussion. I wish I can keep going on, but I think it's probably a good point to transition and get the audience to ask some of the question. So I'd like to open up the floor to the audience. So please type a hard question in the Q&A section, and we'll have the operator post the question with the highest vote on the screen one by one. Question one from Anil from our team. Joe, do you believe in direct lithium extraction startups generating battery grade lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide?
I don't think it matters. A reason I say that is in the current short environment, it's more important that the product get made, it's a reasonable quality, and it can get upgraded if it needs to be. But yes, I absolutely believe ultimately DLE will be able to produce at least as good a product, if not better, than what you're currently seeing from ponds and the carbonate process on the back
That's
of the pond.
encouraging. All right. So the next question, how do you see the chances for a startup compare with a large company like Rio Tinto that are in process of starting the lithium business? Do they have a chance?
I look at a company like Lithium Americas. They have three world class assets. They're just now beginning startup on one of them with Gangfen. I was involved in introducing them to Gangfen and helping that happen. I don't think they're at any disadvantage now to Rio. I think Rio actually needs to catch up with Lithium Americas. Had the big miners decided lithium was attractive a few years ago, they would be dominating the industry now. They didn't do that. Any of the big guys who get in, they're going to have a learning curve too.
Right.
Isn't Lithium is not a mining business. Let's just debunk that right now. Lithium is a chemical business that may or may not have a mining component.
Oh,
Brine operations aren't mining.
that's true. I have a chemical engineering background and I look at chemical plants. Doesn't look like mining, so that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I've just kind of given up. Every journalist just likes to call it mining. And in Western Australia, they mine first, then they beneficiate spodumene concentrate, and then it goes to a chemical process. But at the end of the day, what makes the battery work is chemistry, not mining.
Very well said. So let's move to the next one. Will the market share dominance of large lithium company create significant entry or barrier to newcomers, or the demand is large enough for everyone to win?
Yeah, if you'd asked me that question 5 years ago, I probably would have said, yeah, it's going to be tougher, but that's no longer the case. The Big Four needs to become the Big 10 or the Big 12. That's going to take a decade or more, but there's plenty of room for juniors. And now I think money will flow to juniors now that car companies are finally figuring it out. What they should have listened to 5 to 7 years ago. They are slow learners. I think juniors have a tougher path, but I don't think it's an insurmountable situation.
Very well. So, next question. Why is the US government not so supportive of lithium mining? Shouldn't we be regulating CO2 footprint, water consumption amount, and incentivize sustainable mining methods?
I think it comes down to politics. And unfortunately, I think the energy transition's become a bipartisan thing, place where both sides shoot at each other. And I think that's a shame. I think that when Biden came out and said, "Hey, I want 50% EVs by 2030," the next day, the squad came out and said, "Well, we don't want any mining in the US." And that's really ironic to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, you can't isolate climate change to a country. There aren't barriers that stop pollution at national borders. So the idea that it's better to keep it out of the US and have it done someplace else where there aren't as many rules, whether we're talking about oil and gas or whether we're talking about lithium, I just think it's a joke. I think the US should take the position that we're going to better regulate our mining industry than maybe some places in Africa would. And we're actually better off supporting mining because there is no energy transition without mining. End of story. Uh, I think, unfortunately, the people want to perceive it as a democratic thing that wants EVs but doesn't want mining, and a Republican thing that somehow they favor pollution, which is nonsense. And until people get over that, I think you're going to see a lot of the same rhetoric in the
Mm.
press.
And if we do mining in the US, do you think that the sources that we have with the technologies that we have, would we be able to be at the same cost parity compared to lithium that's coming out of, I think you mentioned South America, Australia, and China? Yeah.
Well, the reason the two mines in North Carolina shut down is because it was cheaper to do in South America. It was cheaper
Mhm.
to do brine. We live in a different world now, and we need to let go of that kind of thinking because right now it's more important. If we take a step back into that era, it was a pretty small difference in cost compared to what we look at now. We had a couple of lithium producers in the Western world up until 1996 or 7 when SQM started and made it three producers in the Western world. And now you're looking at a cost curve that the high cost guy, if you do lepidolite in China, is going to be maybe 8 to 10x higher than the Atacama. And when you start to factor in the ESG considerations, it's even worse than that. And
Mm.
when I say the Atacama, that's X royalty. I'm talking
Mhm.
about purely the cost to extract it from the ground.
And with royalty, what does it look like right now?
Well, with royalty at a high price, I think if you have a $70,000 carbonate price, Corfo is getting a little over 25,000 a ton for that when you run it through the model, because everything over 10,000 for lithium carbonate has a 40% royalty. It's stair step to
Wow.
that point. So it's significant. Actually,
That's
if you would have said even a year ago, but for sure 2 years ago, that lithium would contribute more than copper to the coffers of Chile, you'd have got laughed out of the room. But this year, lithium is going to contribute billions of dollars to the Chilean government.
wow. The world is a different place from the year ago.
The change isn't going to stop now. And that's why everybody who throws out the big numbers for EV penetration but says lithium prices are going in half in 2 to 3 years, that makes no sense. Lithium price will continue to be disconnected from the cost curve, I believe, for at least 5, probably 7 or more years. And when it reconnects with the cost curve is going to be so high with some things like lepidolite in that you're not going back to price that we saw in 2019. Those days are over.
That is sad for the one who wants to own a Tesla.
I think somebody needs to buy this woman a Tesla.
Next question. What innovations do you see are needed to mitigate the side environmental impact of lithium mining and are getting tractions?
And are getting tractions. I'm not sure what that last part means, but first of all, I think there's a lot of assumptions made about the environmental impact of lithium mining. I think it's actually exaggerated because what people will say, and we see this in even our government, when people talk about responsible mining, they always draw analogies to like the 1880s and something happened in Colorado. And it wasn't lithium for one thing, but usually it's just the most horrific abuses of the past. I think we're past that. And I think if the government does its job in just enforcing existing regulations, I mean, obviously the earth's going to be disturbed. Anybody who thinks that mining is going to be 100% free of environmental impact then should not have an iPhone, should not use
Yeah,
the internet, just walk away from everything because there is going to be some impact no matter what you do if you're going to mine material. The
same
point
as
is,
drilling oil as well.
if you're not willing to make trade offs, then yes, turn in your iPhone or your Android tomorrow and write me a letter about it.
Fair enough. So maybe we can address one or two more questions. So, question from Maxime. What is your opinion on greenfield exploration versus development of current projects?
I'm not 100% sure what the intent of the question is, but you need both. And obviously, a brownfield in most scenarios is going to be less expensive than greenfield, but there are plenty of new things to be discovered. I would suggest that anybody who's interested in that look up a guy named Tom Benson who is doing more to find. He's a volcanologist. He works for Lithium Americas. He's been on the podcast a couple of times. It's a shameless plug for Tom. But he knows that, first of all, lithium's associated with volcanic activity. And there's a lot more lithium out there than what's on the maps you can pull up on Google right now. And Tom, if you're listening, if I'm wrong, please weigh in.
Great. So let's try one last question. This is from Andrew. What is one piece of advice that you would share with early startup founders developing lab scale innovations in the battery technology space?
Keep as much of it for yourself as you can and find partners that truly believe in what you're doing and aren't just looking for the 10 bagger.
Hmm. Well, that is wonderful. I would like to thank you for being with us today. This is very insightful. And for all of who join us during the session, thank you for taking the time to participate. I hope you feel more informed. I am very much more informed. And more importantly, I hope you feel more inspired to be a part of this energy transition journey to a much lower carbon economy. It's not going to be easy, and that's why we need support from everyone to get us there. We want you to be a part of this conversation, this movement. And I strongly encourage you to attend our next session. It will be our last panel session of TDK Ventures Energy Week 2022. And we will dig even deeper on the future of mining and battery supply chain with four amazing panelists. I hope you stick around and give a big shout out to the panelists in the next session. And I'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Bye bye.
Bye bye.